Okay. Good afternoon. It's noon plus 3. I'm very happy to welcome you all at IFI, the Sam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, for what is the first of a series we intend at IFI to do in the starting of fall, but today is the first one, a series of book discussions to highlight, of course, current affairs, current events, but also to be much more in tune with the production, the literature production in our field, which is mainly public policy and international affairs. So I'm very happy that this is the first, and I'm very happy to welcome you for this first. I'm also very happy because this first event of the book discussion is completely an AUB panel event. So we are all here on the stage, members of the faculty and the university, and this is something very important for us at IFI because we really want to strengthen, consolidate our bonds with the various bodies of the faculty, and especially today with a particular department at AUB, which is the PSPA, the Political Science and Public Administration Department, to which I remotely belong. I'm honored to do that, to be so, but also because IFI is, given its focus of work, is very strongly related to the things that are done at the PSPA department. So this is why we are also very happy to start with very eminent colleagues of the department. I will introduce them in a minute. The topic also is very important. Now, when today you go to conferences, to meetings, even you talk to diplomats, and you mention Syria, the first answer, the reflex, is that Syria is today maybe on the back burner. It's a past crisis. It's a crisis that is over. Some people, and you will tell us more, Dr. Ohannes, talk about it as a frozen conflict. However, beneath the surface, Syria is coming back to the forefront. It's coming back for many reasons. First of all, because Gaza has probably also put a new light on what's happening in the region. It's back also because Russia is today starting maybe to get less distracted with Ukraine and will be probably back more forcefully to a theater it has invested very much, and you will tell us this, Dr. Ohannes, starting of 2015. Also, now we were informed lately of a meeting between President Erdogan and President Assad, meaning that Turkey is also normalizing its relation with Syria, and the next American elections also will probably have an effect on the American policy in Syria. So for many reasons, Syria is not over. Syria is still a hot spot, and for us Lebanese, what's happening in Syria is crucial. Syria is at our doors. Syria is intrinsically linked to Lebanese dynamics, so it's very important to understand what's happening there. Now, the book that we are discussing today, Dr. Ohannes Geukjian's book, is on the Russian military intervention in Syria. This was a pivotal moment in the Syria war that lasted 12 years. I still remember 30 September 2015, the Russian Moscow, President Vladimir Putin took the decision to intervene in Syria. It was a huge decision for the fate of Syria, probably the dynamics of the region, probably for Russia itself. This decision was very, let's say, difficult to understand, and this is partly what we will highlight today or try to understand today, and then the effect of which are also still enduring, and this is what we will tackle today. So what triggered this intervention, how it was done on the ground, what effects did it produce, and today and tomorrow what to be expected out of this. For all this, we have a fantastic panel, as I said. All of them are AUB. So first and foremost, our main discussant, because he's the author of this book, Dr. Ohannes Geukjian. He's a assistant professor at Associate Professor, at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. He's the chair of the department until, I think, today, so far. And so he will tell us, I will give him the floor first. He will tell us what is in the book, what was in the book when he wrote it, and what is today in the book given the current situation. And then we have also Dr. Hilal Khashan, professor at the department, specialist of international relations, who will shed a light on the international context of this intervention and the international context of what surrounded Syria until today, with probably some highlights on the American foreign policy in the region, the American decision over Syria, and what to expect probably from the coming presidency in the US if, of course, none of the two presidents are shot by a crazy killer. And last but not least, Yeghia Tashjian, who's our fellow at IFI, a former student of the PPIA master's program, a student of both Dr. Khashan and Dr. Ohannes, so I think you must be happy to see your students now elevated to the rank of researchers. Yeghia is of course very knowledgeable about a lot of things in the area, but he mainly focuses also on Iran and Turkey, two regional powers that were very much in touch with the Russian intervention in Syria. So this is the order. I will give the floor to Dr. Geukjian for 15 minutes, then Dr. Khashan for 10 minutes, Yeghia 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor. So without further ado, and again welcoming you, the floor is yours, Dr. Ohannes. Thank you.
Thank you for Dr. Bahout. Thank you for your remarks and the detailed introduction about the event and about the contents of the book. This event is particularly important because the themes that were discussed in the book are still timely. Syria, as Dr. Bahout already said, Ukraine, the policy of the European Union. So we cannot take one of these conflicts separately and ignore the others. All of them are related. We cannot discuss Syria without referring to Ukraine. We cannot understand why there was the conflict in Ukraine without referring to the European Eastern Partnership and NATO enlargement. So the book discusses a number of themes. Yes, the title is about the Russian military intervention in Syria, but it discusses more than Syria. It discusses Russian foreign policy. It discusses, certainly in addition to Syria, Ukraine. It discusses NATO enlargement. It discusses American-Russian relations that waxed and waned during Obama and then during Trump's presidency. It discusses the role of regional actors, Turkey, Iran, also non-state actors, Hezbollah, a proxy of Iran, who has been fighting in Syria since 2011. So these are all of them, all these issues and are interrelated, so we cannot discuss one of them and ignore the others. Now, why Russia intervened in 2015 militarily and did not intervene in 2011 when the conflict started? The book examines actually the reasons, the causes. Russian foreign policy immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then with Putin when he became president in 2000, things took different direction. One major theme that is, I believe, the core of the book is about status. And I do say in the book that status inconsistency leads to conflict. Because states, when they lose their current status, are frustrated, and therefore they face a situation that is called status inconsistency. This is exactly what Russia faced after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The first president of Russia, Yeltsin, tried, to play a sort of open door diplomacy with the United States and Europe, expecting that the US and the major powers in the world would accept Russia to the higher status club, but this didn't happen. I'm not going to go to details because there is no time. I have only 15 minutes. So probably we can address many things during the Q&A. So Russia was frustrated when actually the West did not respect Russia. And here I would like to open a parenthesis to say that in IR, prestige is very important. Emotion is very important. We usually talk about hard power, and sometimes we ignore prestige, respect, emotion, which are key issues. And if a state that is trying to achieve higher status and it is not respected by the international community, particularly the major powers, United States and the rest, the major European powers, then certainly that would lead to conflict, and this is exactly what happened. In 2000, when Putin came to power, became president, 2001, the 9/11 attacks, if we compare Putin's foreign policies at that time, initially, when he took office, and later on, the foreign policies that he pursued, certainly initially Putin was not assertive, because he still expected that the United States would consider Russia's national interests and Russia's strategic interests at the global level. Syria was one of them. So it didn't happen. 2011, when the Arab Spring started, it is one of the themes of the book. 2011, when Russia lost Libya, things started to deteriorate, American-Russian relations. By the way, always, Dr. Bahout had already referred to it a while ago, we cannot ignore American-Russian relations. Even in the future, if these conflicts are going to be solved, certainly that will happen within the context of American-Russian rapprochement, which is currently very unlikely. So the conflicts continue. Sometimes Syria, probably sometimes frozen, but violence occurs from time to time, continuously. When Russia lost Libya in 2011, that was a turning point. And the Arab Spring had started, the Syrian insurgency actually started, which very quickly transformed to a civil war, bloody sectarian civil war. Meanwhile, just back a little bit, many things were occurring in former Soviet space, one of them Ukraine, the other one Georgia. So Putin was categorically against regime change by force, categorically against the color revolutions, because that would create instability, categorically against losing friendly regimes and friendly states in the region and in the near abroad, as it is called, those former Soviet republics that became independent still refer to them as near abroad. So these things are very sensitive. Color, Orange Revolution in Ukraine, 2003, 2024, then 2014, annexation of the Crimea, because Putin was using power politics, the military, in foreign policy, rather than soft power and diplomacy to achieve his goals. So this is very important, the use of power politics. It was a sort of message to the West that you, dear Western countries and the United States, you cannot continue in the way that you have been doing. You need to respect our national interests, our strategic interests. You need to stop missile defense systems, deploying them to near the borders of the Russian Federation. So armaments is part of it. Fighting terrorism, international terrorism, is another theme that is dealt in the book. Yes, Russian-American relations were not actually in harmony, but at many times, Russia and the United States, not publicly, there was no public agreement, but there were the convergence of interests because both of them were engaged in fighting international terrorism and ISIS in Syria and elsewhere. So that was a field where there was cooperation. In 2015, after losing Libya, 5 more minutes I have. In 2015, after losing Libya, the Syrian regime was facing difficult moments, and taking into account that Syria was a former Soviet ally during the Cold War period, Putin made the decision to intervene militarily to rescue, first of all, the regime of Bashar al-Assad, or the Syrian regime. The other goal was to fight international terrorism, as he put it, and the third goal is certainly to establish a footstep in the Mediterranean. That was a very old Russian dream, unfulfilled for decades, and now it became real. And certainly the message was clear also to the international community that changing regimes by force is not allowed, so no way for that in Syria, no way for toppling friendly regimes. Concerning terror, very much emphasis on terrorism and ISIS after the Russian intervention, military intervention in Syria, that terrorism is a danger to all states, Western and non-Western in the world, and. So, although later on, Putin made it clear that a number of times that the intervention actually was not personal, and the aim was not to keep Bashar al-Assad in power, and he said it a number of times, but the aim was much bigger. It was much bigger. It was geopolitics. It was certainly to fulfill Russian goals. As I said a while ago, using the military to achieve power politics to achieve higher status. However, this goal was not fulfilled. It was not materialized, mainly because in order to achieve higher status, that particular state should have strong economy, bringing a contribution to the global GDP, diplomacy, so on and so forth. So the military was not enough and is not enough. This was made clear to Russia a number of times. Sometimes Russia was invited to the G20 summits. That was very important, and the G7 in particular, the G7, sometimes it became G8. Well, that was very important for Russia because Russia was respected when it was invited to the G8 summit. It was respected. Russia's views were taken into consideration. Russia wanted to have a say in global political issues, to participate in solving conflicts at the global level. This was also actually an attribute of great power status, being able to use diplomacy successfully to bring solution to conflicts everywhere at the global level. So intervention in Syria, part of it was related to diplomacy. One more minute. Part of it related to diplomacy and to bring peace. And that's why the book examines in detail the Astana peace process, the platform actually that was well complementary probably to the Geneva platform in 2012 that it started by the UN and the international community to bring a solution to the Syrian conflict. So we have two platforms there. Although Astana, frozen for a long time, but recently, I think a month ago, reactivated. Still, the conflict is not solved. So bringing a contribution to the resolution of international, because Syrian conflict has already become international. This is not a local conflict. The Ukraine conflict has become international. Certainly the book did not discuss the invasion of Ukraine because the book was published in 2022. But what is related to Ukraine in the book, I think, is very much timely, and we can build on it. So I would like to stop here. I consumed my time, and probably in the Q&As we'll have more time to elaborate on. Thank you, Dr. Bahout.
Thank you very much, Ohannes. Let's strip and put off titles now, academic titles. We're among friends and colleagues. Thank you very much for this presentation and of course for the book. Of course, it's illimited. We can talk about millions of things. What I liked in the way you presented the book, and probably the book is also rich on these three levels. Through such a book, we're talking about a case study, Russia and Syria, but through this, we shed several lights on very important topics for us, specialists, students, would-be experts of international affairs. First of all, we talk about Syria per se, the Syria crisis, which is one of the most probably bloody conflicts in the 21st century so far. Then we talk about Russia's foreign policy in general, and this sheds a light on Russia's status, and Russia is probably one of the three major superpowers today on the planet, so it's important. And then, for me, what's interesting, because we're at a university gathering, also you shed a light on theories of international affairs that are unrelated to Russia or Syria. For example, status inconsistency, the role of emotions, the role of personal decisions, how a decision is made, etc., which are crucial for any students of international affairs. And for this, really, we have to thank you. Without further ado, now to discuss all this and probably shed some light on the international system, Dr. Hilal, the floor is yours for 10 minutes, please.
Yeah. Speaking of 10 minutes, I had to write my notes to respect the time and to make sure that I cover all the important observations about Professor Geukjian's book. So I hate reading my notes, but I have to do it to make sure that I cover everything. In his seminal book on Russia's military intervention in Syria, Professor Geukjian asserts that its primary motive was its demand for higher status. This is a key statement. Vladimir Putin has aspired to reposition Russia as a great power since he became president in 2000. Despite its status of inconsistent power. Now, inconsistent powers mean that despite its economic weakness, this term describes Russia as a politically overachieving country, mainly thanks to its military capabilities and nuclear arsenal. Russia's quest for recognition goes back to Peter the Great in the 18th century, who wanted to modernize Russia. He traveled to Western Europe incognito to come to grips with the instruments of European modernization. Even during the Soviet era and the recognition of the Soviet Union as a superpower in a bipolar world, its long-serving Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Gromyko, yes, he served as Minister of Foreign Affairs for 27 years. Gromyko entertained the idea that his country had achieved the same status as the United States. He claimed that no international question of importance could be decided without the Soviet Union or in opposition to it. The former Soviet Union indeed had absolute power in its satellite countries in Eastern Europe. However, outside that region, Moscow behaved primarily as a spoiler, not the decision maker. For example, in 1955, then the Secretary General of the CPSU, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, decided to open up to Egypt and supply it with military hardware. In what became known as the Czech arms deal, since the USSR did not want to become directly involved in the Middle East that lay outside its sphere of influence, as per the Big Three agreement at Yalta in 1945. Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, they divided the world at Yalta. Following the arms deal with Egypt, Moscow supplied weapons to other Arab countries, notably Syria. The Soviet Union had no intention or interest in dominating the region, as it only hoped to coexist with the West and weaken its domination of its politics. Despite its significant arms sale to Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, the Soviet Union did not attempt to tilt the balance of military balance against Israel, in compliance with the agreement in 1950 of the foreign ministers of the US, Great Britain, and France. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became Secretary General of the CPSU. He concluded that the Soviet Union was not salvageable and coined the new thinking policy that departed from communist ideology. Gorbachev changed the premises upon which the Soviet Union rested and shifted his policies from conflict to solidarity. He believed that each country should choose its political system. He believed in the need for the Soviet Union to cooperate with the West, both economically and politically. Thank you. Both Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin, Russia's first president, believed in the importance of economic and political cooperation with the West, specifically the US. However, the 1993 parliamentary elections in Russia produced a neo-imperial trend that violated the premises of Gorbachev's new thinking due to its proneness to military adventurism. Russia intervened militarily, primarily in Chechnya, the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the first war between them, Georgia and Tajikistan. Its aggressiveness in the countries of the near abroad refers to the former republics of the Soviet Union, in its aggressiveness in the countries of the near abroad prompted NATO to expand eastward. Russia could not accept Ukraine's independence and Kiev as the capital of a foreign country. Russia's easy occupation of Crimea in 2014 emboldened it to intervene militarily in Syria in 2015 to save President Bashar Assad's faltering regime. Putin intervened in Syria ostensibly to fight terrorism. Still, in reality, the indiscriminate Russian Air Force attacks that killed scores of civilians strengthened the extreme militant groups such as the Islamic State and the Yeghia Tashjian due to the radicalization of moderate Islamic groups. In 2014, pro-Moscow Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych lost his power, and Putin did not want to see Assad, another dictator, lose power because of a popular uprising, fearing his turn would be next. The Russian military campaign in Syria was possible because the US had little interest in the country. And it only happened after the death of Saudi King Abdullah, who wanted to see the fall of Assad's regime. Saudi foreign policy towards Syria tilted in favor of Assad's government after the ascendancy of King Suleiman in the beginning of 2015. Even though the UAE severed its ties with Syria after the 2011 uprising, it did not support any rebel group, and in 2018 it restored full diplomatic relations with Assad's regime. After the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons in Ghouta in 2013, US President Barack Obama reneged on a promise that the use of chemical weapons was a red line that would invite US military intervention. He even accepted Russian mediation to get rid of Syria's chemical stockpiles in what appeared as a diplomatic victory for Moscow. Russia prevailed in Syria, but it had to reckon with the interests of Iran, Turkey, the US, and the autonomous Kurdish administration. Syria's conflict has become frozen, and Russia is managing it, although lacking the capabilities to resolve it. Success in Syria emboldened Putin to invade Ukraine. He expected his special operation to end smoothly within a few weeks. Success in Syria is one thing, and prevailing in Ukraine is another matter, because it impacts NATO countries. Putin's desire to reposition Russia as a great power hinges on the outcome of the Ukraine war, not success in Syria. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hilal. Very interesting comments also, because first of all, you did very well to start with a long historical perspective of Russia's history. I mean, we know that countries have a very long memory. Even if the regime changes, sometimes their DNA continues to exist or to make them act. And in the case of Russia, it's well known. Dr. Geukjian, for example, mentioned the very old quest to establish a foothold in the Mediterranean. It's more than many decades. Since we were at school, we used to learn that Russia's quest is to have a foot in the warm waters of the Mediterranean. This is something we studied at school. It traces back to Tsars, and it's still ongoing. You did well to mention this quest for grandeur, and this very interesting, but it's outside our scope here, but I would like to have one day this debate about, is Russia a European country or a Western power or an Eastern power? The same applies to Turkey, as you know, Yeghia. And these questions are very fascinating in international relations, I mean, the political culture. And second, what you did also very interestingly, and this is the transition to Yeghia, is to also shed a light on the links between this intervention, the US, here I don't know how to qualify it. U.S. passivity, U.S. complicity, U.S. disinterest, it's something still open, at least for me. And then the Saudi Arabia policy, which we haven't mentioned, which is very interesting, and the Gulf powers, and then Turkey and Iran. Talking of which, this is the perfect transition for you, Yeghia, also for 10 minutes to shed a light on how the regional powers perceived the intervention in Syria. You know that there's an urban legend or a cliche that still runs, and we don't know if it's true, that in fact 2 days before the Russian intervention, Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian warlord, war chief, flew to Moscow to beg Vladimir Putin to intervene because the regime was collapsing in Latakia, and the forces of the rebellion were at 10 kilometers from Kardaha, the birthplace of the Assad family. We still don't know if this is true. We will probably never know, but this also sheds a light on what is still open today, which is the relation between Russia and Iran in Syria and elsewhere. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, everyone. So if we will try to analyze or examine Turkey's and Iran's perception of Russia's intervention, first of all, it's important to divide between the war in Ukraine and after, because Russia's relation with Turkey and Iran before the invasion of Ukraine was to some extent asymmetric in favor of Russia. And the other two regional powers, to some extent, were junior powers respect to Russia. After the war, we start realizing that Russia is now purchasing drones from Iran. Russia's dependence on Iran increased, even not just militarily, but also when it comes to economic corridors, connecting South Caucasus and so on. And the same is also on Turkey. And we realize this impact not just in the Middle East, but mainly in South Caucasus when it comes to conflict resolution and so forth. So Iran basically has three objectives in Syria, and to some extent I see that in the future there will be a clash, let's say a silent clash or competition with Russia when it comes to these objectives. The first Iran objective is to penetrate Syria's military and security institutions. And unlike the Russians, where the Russians prefer to have a centralized Syrian security institutions, the Iranians are trying to construct, let's say, or cultivate a horizontal non-state networks in the form of proxies which function function parallelly with Syrian state institutions. This is, of course, is also in conflict with Russia's interest. And also Iran views Syria as a deterrent force against Israel. The second objective from the Iran perspective is to control the economic routes in Syria, mainly the Syrian-Iraqi border from Bukamal in the Deir Zor province. This is very strategic because also it is area rich of mineral resources, oil, gas, and phosphate. And also this route paves the way towards the airport of Aleppo and also Latakia's port and also Lebanon. So this is very strategic, but this also goes hand in hand with Russia's policy of controlling the economic routes. I remember last year when I was in St. Petersburg, so I asked these questions to Maria Zakharova, like why Russia wants to control the economic corridors in South Caucasus. She was very honest. She told me that because we want to have an access to the Eastern Mediterranean. So both the Russians and the Iranians, they view this interconnectivity very important. And the third objective is soft power, actually, because the Iranians are establishing religious, cultural, and educational centers mainly in the eastern territories of Syria and also the south bordering Israel. This is very interesting because I don't know if anyone actually went to Syria after 2011. The cultural image of Damascus has completely changed, especially in the suburb area. Rarely people are talking about this, but Damascus is not the same, at least culturally, as it is now, if we will compare it before 2011. Turkey's objectives are very interesting because there was evolution when it comes to identifying Turkey's objectives in Syria. The first, initially it was to topple the Assad regime, and then it changed to some extent to gradually accept the reality, but the main objective is now to contain the Kurdish autonomic aspirations. And Russia's intervention, despite the fact that the Turks were very cautious and alarmed, because the Turks thought that the Russians would maybe try to promote Kurdish separatism. As we know that in the 1990s there was excellent relations between the PKK and Kremlin, and also the Russians proposed a federal republic of Syria. This is something that the Iranians opposed, and it is very interesting how Syria actually is playing or balancing the Russians and the Iranians. Whenever the Russians are pressuring Assad, he goes to Tehran, he brings the Iranians to balance the Russians. So it's like a play card always Assad is playing. When it comes to Turkey, so the Kurdish autonomy is a red line. The Russian intervention actually it gave to some extent through the Astana process, as Dr. Ohannes mentioned, it gave to some extent a legitimacy to Turkish enrollment and also the Iranian enrollment. And to some extent the Astana, we can say that it replaced the Western-backed Geneva process. The second important diplomatic success was the Turkish military operations in northeastern Syria. It divided actually the three Kurdish cantons, separated them, it occupied Afrin. It also now demilitarized and created buffer zones. And this was a win-win solution for both the Russians and the Turks, because from the Russian perspective it minimized the US enrollment and influence, and from the Kurdish perspective it's hopeless actually for the Kurds to have any political entity in the future. Now the problem is the reconciliation. I think this will be a very slow process between Turkey and Assad. I remember a year ago I was meeting with a Kurdish official in Lebanon and a Syrian journalist very close to the Syrian government. And the journalist was saying that, look, now the Kurds, it's like a burnt cart. We don't need the Kurds anymore, because the Kurds are to some extent are stuck. Either they have to fight with the Turks or they have to compromise with Assad. And in 2015 and 16, after the clash between ISIS and the Kurds, when the Kurds were victorious, especially the Syrian Democratic Forces, they had more strong legitimacy and power to engage with Assad. But now their power is to some extent minimized. And from the Turkish perspective, also there is like a very difficult balance. By compromising with Assad, at the same time they have the issue of the return of the refugees, and also how they will try to leverage thousands of the Syrian National Army or the militias in favor of the Syrian opposition militias where Turkey is funding. So now they are in a very difficult balance, the Turks. Either they have to reconcile with Assad and accept the reality, but at the same time they will get certain consensus from the Turks, maybe another military operation, or at the same time the Kurds have to compromise with Assad and forget about any political aspirations, but then we have the Syrian opposition backed by Turkey. So it's a very complex situation where we are now.
Okay. Thank you, Yeghia. I think your analysis of Turkey and Iran and other regional players' role is very interesting, because when you were speaking, I was thinking that actually and here we are also back to something very theoretical in international relations, which is this question of conflict and cooperation. You know, we teach this to our students constantly. In Syria, it's very interesting because we have two couples that are in an equation of conflict/cooperation. We have Russia and Syria, Russia and Iran. And we talked about it. So where do they conflict? Where do they cooperate? How do they compete, etc.? And then we have Iran and Turkey also, who are considered widely and maybe very simplistically to be rivals. One is a big Sunni power, the other is a big Shia power. They are on opposite sides sometimes here and there, but in Syria they are of course opposing but also cooperating, and you mentioned, Dr. Ohannes, the Astana format, where Russia is in fact the broker bringing together Turkey and Iran, which tells us that things are much more, very much more complicated than they seem to be. I would like to maybe have a first round of dialogue with you three, and then we open the floor to the room by putting some of the questions. Dr. Ohannes, on exactly the title of your book, Russian Military Intervention. When Russia intervened, I was in Washington. I was at Carnegie in Washington, and you know, in think tanks in DC, you always have dialogues with decision makers and etc. And there were two cliches in Washington at that time. One is that the Russian intervention is a low-cost intervention, meaning it was done with very few means, in fact, 15 planes and a few thousand soldiers, so it was not very costly, but it succeeded mainly because, as you said, of the also the air power, but also the lack of opposition.
Sure.
No one opposed it. Yeah. And the US did not oppose it. I'm not sure, I'm sure that it's lack of interest, but also having been in Washington at that time, the obsession was reaching a deal with Iran. It was the negotiation with the GCPOA. We don't want to intervene in Syria in any way, not to antagonize the Iranians because we are discussing with them the GCPOA. This was the mood at that time, and Rob Malley, whom I used to see very often, was constantly telling me, we have a much more important objective in the Middle East, it's the GCPOA. So this is interesting. So would it be replicable elsewhere, such an intervention? I'm not sure. Which leads me to my second question for both of you, the linkage with Ukraine. Some people say Putin would have never invaded Ukraine if he had been cornered and blocked in Syria. It's the permissivity, the easiness with which he swallowed Syria that gave him the impression that he can do that in Ukraine. But at the same time, as you said also, Ukraine is not the same as Syria. I mean, it's a much bigger piece to chew. And the fact that, as you said also, he was still unrecognized even after Syria. He felt the need to intervene in Ukraine in order to get recognition. But this intervention further takes him away from recognition. So this is a dilemma of powers. I mean, you need to acquire status by intervening. You intervene, but then you degrade your status because you have intervened. So it's a sort of dilemma of great powers. For Yeghia, maybe I would put a question that we haven't mentioned. It's a bit sensitive here, but Russia's role in Syria is interesting also towards an actor we haven't mentioned at all, which is Israel. It's very interesting that one of the arguments of Russia's intervention in Syria was that we are deploying a formidable air defense, you know, the famous S-400 and etc. This has not prevented Israel one day to conduct very destructive raids over Syria, unhinged by the S-400, whom, by the way, I've never seen in action, so I don't know if they exist or not. So this is an interesting question also that sheds a light on Russia's, let's say, duplicity towards that. And this is one factor of tension between, I think, Russia and Iran potentially. I will not be longer than that, but maybe if you can very quickly react to these points, the one you choose, and then we'll open
his question is more
floor.
interesting.
The questions of
Russia's duplicity.
Duplicity.
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to start on that, please?
No.
Go ahead.
You know, Russians did not deploy the S-400; they deployed S-300, which is obsolete. Okay, it never. They used it more than twice to intercept incoming Israeli planes, but they did not shoot down any of them. Now, Russia. I mean, Putin maintained excellent relations with Netanyahu, and he allowed Israel to strike at Iranian assets in Syria with impunity. And at the same time, he did not stop the Iranians from trying to maintain their presence in Syria and try to create a front near the Golan Heights, which they did not succeed in doing. Now, let me turn to the first question quickly. You asked about the cost of Russia's military intervention in Syria. The Russians succeeded in Syria because they launched an air campaign, and they didn't really have enemy to confront, you know, and so they were able to crush the opposition, a task that neither the Iranians nor Hezbollah were able to accomplish in Syria. It's true. I think the Iranians appealed to the Russians to intervene in Syria. Now, in Ukraine, it was a different matter. It was a ground operation, and the ground operation showed the vulnerability of the Russian forces, especially during the first few weeks. It was a disaster for them.
Yes. Dr. Ohannes, maybe you can weigh on this, and I will add an additional question, which is more politics. I mean, to be back to politics. Russia, partly the argument of Russia's intervention towards the West, at least, was that, okay, we will be part of the political process. You know, the famous 2254, UN Security Council resolution 2254, that is let's say, the Bible for Syria today. But I hope it will not be like the 242 for the Arab-Israeli conflict. I mean, completely dead for centuries. But this is the argument. But so far, Russia has not been able, I don't know if it has been willing, to extract any concession from the regime on the way of political reforms that would help put an end to the Syria conflict. So all these questions are for you if you want to weigh in. And this is a limit of Russia's, let's say, diplomatic capacity in Syria.
To start with the last comment, I think we missed Bashar al-Assad's manipulation of all of them. Bashar al-Assad is manipulating all of them. All of them, I mean, Turkey, Iran, Russia, let me keep the US outside for a while. Turkey, Iran, Russia, all of them need the Assad regime because, I mean, they are not sure what type of regime will succeed the Assad regime. They are not sure. They don't have a candidate. And what could happen to Syria, nobody can predict. That's one point. So Assad is manipulating them, and because they need to keep the regime, things are going in the way that they have been going. When I asked the Iranian ambassador, when I interviewed him in Beirut, not this one, the previous one, I said, who intervened first? He said, we were there before the Russians. I mean, if he told me the truth, I don't know. But he said, we were there before the Russians intervened. Part of it, there is the other version also that the Iranians asked Russia to intervene militarily. I mean, we are not throwing that version out now. It's there. Now, later, I mean, things change a lot. I mean, after a while, the Russians did not want the Iranians to increase their influence in Syria. Now, for example, if we compare it to what's happening now, because Russia is purchasing Iranian drones, so Russian policy towards the Iranian presence in Syria now is different. Concerning the cost of intervention, I think because the Americans did not want to intervene, Barack Obama's focus was pivot to Asia. Pivot to Asia. He was not interested in the Middle East. And Putin actually exploited that opportunity very well. It was a window for him, and he dropped in. He knew that he will not face American resistance, and he thought that, I agree with your analysis also. Later on, he thought that, I mean, he can invest that success in Ukraine also. He did not predict, as far as I can say, he did not predict that the West will unite against him in Ukraine. Something, it was mistake. He was mistaken. Concerning the other issue, that the balancing issue, I mean, all of you, I mean, raised it a while ago. Putin was, yes, that balancing exists. Putin has been successful in keeping good relations with Turkey, with Iran, with Israel. Israel very important in this context because the Israeli planes flew all over Lebanon, sometimes not, and bombed the Iranian positions and the Syrian positions. The Russian anti-aircraft missile actually didn't see them, and the Russians didn't see them. So that mutual agreement is between and among them is still actually in force. And we should not forget that many oligarchs in Russia are from Jewish origin. They are Jews. So Zelensky was a Jew also, is a Jew also. So Putin cannot anger Israel. Israel cannot anger Russia. The same applies to, I mean, when Zelensky told Netanyahu that why you are not preventing the Russians from attacking us, well, I am a Jew, he put it bluntly. He said, I am a Jew, why you are not protecting me? Probably he ignored that the other side is a Jew also.
Okay.
So that balancing that three of you actually raised is absolutely correct, and it has been. I mean, they are using it, the game that is being played by all of them.
So maybe Zelensky and the Jews of Russia don't have the same rabbi. This is why, probably. Yeghia, maybe very quickly on this issue of Russia's balancing game and also the conflict cooperation between Iran and Turkey in Syria, which is, I think, a very fascinating issue, especially in the northeast and the northwest. Can you say a few words
Yes,
on that?
as it is discussed, I think Russia until now successfully, we can say, compartmentalized the relationship between Iran and Turkey, Israel, and also Saudi Arabia when it comes to energy security, because the Gulf states are very important factor. Even I remember, I think it was the Emiratis who proposed Assad to invest in Damascus or Aleppo airport. The Iranians are pressured a bit about this. This is some reports that we read on media. When it comes to Turkey-Iran relations, both agree when it comes to the Kurdish issue. They don't want any Kurdish political entity because also it is a threat for their own territorial integrity and national security. But the problem is that what kind of state do both actors want, even Russia? I mean, the Russians, of course, prefer a centralized secular state. The Iranians, maybe an Iraqi scenario, something a fragmented Syria that serves their security. And Turkey, well, I mean, there are different versions when it comes to Erdogan. He has his own version. The opposition has another version because the opposition Republicans are also secular. From the Erdogan's perspective, the first issue is the return of the refugee because there is now domestic crisis in Turkey against the Syrian refugees. There is, of course, the Kurdish issue where all Turkish political parties agree. And another problem, which is also like an Iranian issue, is the presence of the opposition militias in Idlib, Afrin, and so on. How to integrate these militias in the Syrian army, if there will be any integration, which is also a big challenge and also a conflict of interest between Iran and Turkey.
Okay. I think we have a lot of things on the table now. The floor is yours for question. I will very simply ask you to very quickly say who you are and then put a question, if possible, quite quickly because we still have 30-minute, half an hour. So please, here and then here. Please. So your name, your affiliation, and the question.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm from AUB, and I want to ask you something I was told a few years ago by a person who is very well connected both in the Syrian regime and in Russia. And he said that the Russians intervened in Syria because they wanted to sort of call the shots in Syria to some extent, to have some kind of control regarding what was going to be happening in Syria in the future. But what happened, in fact, was that the Iranians sort of wagged the dog in that because the Russian intervention was so sort of light touch, whereas the Iranians have boots on the ground through their proxy groups, they basically the Iranians turned the Russians into their air force. So the Iranians decide where the military operations are going to happen, what's going to happen, how they're going to be done, and the Russians are reduced to sort of a supporting role because the Air Force on its own can't really control outcomes within the country. So I would be interested in hearing your reaction to that, whether this has some basis in fact or it's just some guy's weird analysis.
Yeah, okay, this is exactly in the chapter of Russia's Iran conflict cooperation. Of course, this cliche is right. I mean, Iran was the boot on the ground, Iran and mainly Hezbollah, and Russia was the air force. And here it's militarily it's a very complicated equation to understand. You can't do one without the other. So probably the success is shared. Now the problem is how to share the, let's say, the trophy that is Syria's regime today. We'll get back to that. There was another question also.
Hello, my name is Hilal Khashan. I'm a media expert. See, my question is more related to the technical aspect. I'd like to know from the doctor, from the scholar, the writer himself. There's no such thing as objectivity, right? There's no view from nowhere. I'd like to know, how does a scholar, obviously, and the rest of the speakers also can delve a bit into this, how does a scholar, a writer, a researcher, let's say, approach a topic, right, with so much facts and authenticity, let me say, just or information or data, and then obviously without compromising his bias, and sort of try to right. This is very interesting. And then obviously the question that I'd like to sort of also put on the table is who, at the end of the day, who wanted to topple the Assad regime and why? Okay. I think it would be interesting and relevant.
Okay, thank you. On the first part of your question, this applies to any topic we deal with. Yeah. This is part of our, let's say, quote-unquote discipline, because I'm not sure that political science is a scientific discipline, but we'll try to answer that. Maybe I give you very quickly the floor, or do we take another question?
Let's take one by one.
Because I would like to give the floor to Yeghia Tashjian, who's a fellow of IFI, who's a Syrian expert himself, a Syrian himself, and a very prominent, internationally recognized expert on Syria's political economy. So maybe you can also integrate this dimension. Thank you, Yeghia.
Please.
Thank you, Joseph. That was very kind. And thank you all for this really interesting debate. I had, my first question is, where do we buy the book from? Is it available? I don't know.
It is.
It is. Where? Antoine?
Bookstore.
Okay, good to know. I was wondering, there was this debate about how the Russians could act without resistance in Syria, not much resistance from the US. Could it be that in a way the US has subcontracted the management of the Syrian crisis? The US has subcontracted to Russia in a way? 2015 is a year after the Islamic State declared the caliphate. The Russians have good ties with the Israelis. Maybe the US saw the Russians as a way to weaken the Iranians. So I wonder whether you think that it could have been, it may have gone to the extent that the US told the Russians basically, go there and we are not going to oppose you. It's a question. You also mentioned the fact that Russia has a lot to gain from Syria, from its presence in Syria, prestige and other assets. So what does it say of the relation between Russia and Syria? Who is the weaker? Who has a hand? Who has a card with the other part? How much Russia can really pressure? How can Russia really pressure Assad if for Russia it is so important to be in Syria, and Bashar knows that? And finally, following on that, how come, if Russia is in good relation with the Israelis, the Iranians, the Turks, how come that to this date, almost 10 years after they intervened, they have been incapable to find a solution to the Syrian crisis?
Maybe if I can push you a little bit further, Jihad, what are the Russian economic benefits from the intervention? We hear a lot about, the Tartus port, the Latakia port, the phosphate, etc. How concrete is this, very quickly?
Very, very little interest, actually. This is what is quite surprising. We track, actually, a lot the Syrian economy. Very few Russian investment in Syria. extremely few. The Tartus port management is a total failure. It's almost dead, the port. The only thing really that works is the phosphate plant. They even had, the government gave them for 25 years the management of the very big fertilizer complex, which is a total failure. It's quite surprising, actually, that they failed that much. And also interesting to know that the Iranians invest very little in Syria. The economic dimension is actually very weak in the...
Thank you.
Well, I am lost. There were many questions. Concerning subcontracting, I don't know. There was no subcontracting. I mean, the Americans were not interested. Very simple. I mean, they were not interested in Syria, in the Middle East in general. The focus is somewhere else. The other question related to Russia, Turkey.
Who has the hand in this very complicated relation? Syria,
Russia,
both need each other, but who needs the other more?
I think at now, actually, the Americans are there, the Russians are there, the Turks are there, the Iranians are there, Hezbollah is there, so everybody is there. And there are the zones of influence. Nobody is crossing to the other zone. The Russians, as I said a while ago, initially did not want to increase Iranian influence, but now it's completely something else, different. Now, who is going to have a say in, because all of them are willing to have a say in Syria's future. It's early now to predict. We cannot predict now, because you have Ukraine actually mixed all the cards. Had there been no Ukraine, probably in Syria we could have reached a sort of solution. But now nobody is ready to discuss Syria anymore. Let's keep it aside. The focus is on Ukraine. The Americans are not interested. This also extends to Lebanon. They are not interested in Lebanon. I mean, who cares? In Syria, the same. By the way, there is a very, just to add one comment to what you said, you are absolutely right. Currently, there are many Syrians, hundreds of thousands who are hungry. There is hunger in Syria now. So you can't get bread if you haven't applied on the application on your mobile phone, because you cannot go to the bakery to get bread. Nobody will give you bread. The same applies to the gas used at homes. Again, you need to apply, and the price is very expensive.
The same. You need to have a smartphone.
Yes.
No, very.
Yes, which means you have to have, you need to have a smartphone. The same applies to petroleum and benzene. There is nothing. But, I mean, nobody is interested in finding a solution, because, as Dr. Bahout a while said in his introductory remarks, let's wait if the Erdogan-Assad meeting will occur. I think things become clearer.
You know, I think the primary objective of Erdogan is to get rid of Syrian refugees in Turkey, because they have become an overwhelming domestic issue. Now, speaking of cooptation, had the U.S. opposed the Russian intervention in Syria, the Russians wouldn't have done it. Now, in 2017, the U.S. terminated the Southern Front, which allowed the regime to take over the region with the support of the Russians. Actually, the Russians sent military police in order to deal with the rebels. The U.S. opened the Southern Front in order to accommodate Syrian troops who defected from the Syrian army. But with the Islamization of the uprising, the U.S. felt that the uprising has taken a new dimension that did not favor U.S. interest in Syria. Now, the U.S. continues to maintain a presence in Syria, in the 10th region, and also in the Kurdish area. The few hundred troops in the north are aimed, I mean, their function is to prevent the Turks from attacking the Kurds and establishing a corridor along the border. And in the 10th, the Americans are interested in preventing Iranian supplies to Hezbollah via Syria. So, I mean, the U.S. has vested interests there, but their interests go beyond Syria.
Can I add one more thing to Jihad? By the way, yes, there is no conflict resolution at the macro level, but there are many peace attempts exactly at the local level, and the Russians have been successful in that.
And by the way, I think this is mainly the Russian technique. It's not to play on the high-level political solution, because here they will be faced with the Americans, with others, with the Gulfies. They prefer to operate low-level musalahat, integrating militiamen into the army, creating Mithl Faylaq al-Khamis and others, and controlling the ground in competition with the Iranians. Now, the problem is that on that ground, they face a better competition, I mean, a competition with a better player who are the Iranian, at least so far. So this is how it's complicated. Yes, you and then you.
I'm Greg, I'm an AUB student. With regards to that, would you say that Russia is more successful when they are using those sort of lower level, more unconventional means like private military contractors, and then when you see they invade Ukraine, more conventional war and faced by like NATO and Western allies, they've been a lot less successful? And then sort of linking to that, given the theories of prestige and status in IR, did the US or the West miss an opportunity in the 90s by not disbanding NATO after the end of the Cold War?
This is for you.
I mean, taking prestige. By the way, the Russians have been unsuccessful in achieving higher status. Yes, they use the military in foreign policy, hoping that they achieved, but they did not. It was counterproductive. I think the Russians now are in a position, very bad position, if we consider Ukraine. I mean, who is going to, given the complexity of the conflict and given the antagonisms, the rivalry between Russia now and the West in general and the United States in particular, I think nobody is going to accept giving higher status to Russia. First of all, we need to think how negotiations would start in order to stop the war. So I don't think it didn't achieve the goal, by the way, in terms of status. It was counterproductive. In Syria, the situation is different. I mean, as we commented a while ago, had there been, yes, I think myself and Hilal are saying the same thing. I think you also agree. Had the Americans
decided to fight.
Exactly. Russia could have not intervened, because Russia was waiting. When the Americans refrained, then Russia jumped in. That was very simple.
And you know, Russia's interests in Syria are quite limited.
Yeah.
Apart from attempting to gain prestige, you know, their interests are in the West. Tartus Naval Facility and Hamimim Air Base. Beyond that, they are not interested.
And this actually brings us to the point that we made a while ago. Yes, their aim was to have a foot exactly in the Mediterranean, because they lost everything. They lost Libya, they lost Iraq, former Soviet allies, billions of dollars of arms contracts when Gaddafi fell, by the way. They lost a lot, and they were not ready to lose Syria. So the airport and the naval base, I think those were the benefits.
Very quickly on the issue of private contractors, what's interesting is that in Syria, Wagner was not very important. until the last 2-3 years, but it was not very important on the battleground. So it was mainly done by the Russian army and, as Hilal said, by the Air Force. They were not on the ground. The only place where Wagner had a minimal presence was in the Battle of Palmyra, but after the conquest of Palmyra, just for the cleaning, quote unquote, and probably the pillage and etc.
They were mauled by the Americans. I think it was 2018.
Exactly. So Syria is not a good case to study private contractors in the Russian army. Yeghia wanted to add something. Then I will take 2 questions or 3 questions.
I forgot, but yeah, regarding Iran and Russia, whether Russia is being used as Iran's air force, the Battle of Idlib 2019 actually contradicts this argument because the Iranians were not in favor of the ceasefire, and the Russians engaged with Turkey in a ceasefire without notifying the Iranians. At least this, because the Iranians were pushing more and more, and when Turks, they used the Bayraktar, they destroyed all the hard power of the Syrians. So the Russians were like, we have to have a ceasefire. Regarding Ukraine and so forth, yes, definitely. The conflict resolution in Ukraine will also impact Syria. Actually, the American scholar, Missionary, he gave 2 options a few days ago in his interview about Ukraine. He said that either Ukraine will become a neutral state, but in return it has to regain all the lost territories, and this is a red line for Russia, or Ukraine should join NATO but should forget all the lost territories, which from the Russian perspective, like, okay, they have a buffer zone. And also from the Russian perspective, I think they would not be against to give back the buffer zone, but not the 2014 territories plus Crimea, which is, again, I don't see a conflict resolution in Ukraine because both sides still have not compromised, unfortunately.
Okay, we'll try to be quick now. 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you. My question is, as Dr. Geukjian had mentioned in the beginning, certain elements of the Russian regime. I have a question. After the 1993 constitutional crisis, which affected the presidency of Russia and it killed certain elements of Russian democracy, which gave the presidency absolute power, if it hadn't happened and Russia had maintained its certain democratic elements, would it still have intervened in, have done the power politics, have you said, in Russia or Eastern Europe? And can I ask a follow-up question, just a small?
Very quickly.
Yes. And the recent elections, the Iranian elections, the new president of Iran has said that he's looking for better relations with the West. It's too early to say, but if it were the case, how would it affect Russia's role in Syria, and how would it affect Iran's presence in the Middle East?
Yeah, interesting questions. Please.
Okay. Hello, my name is Arman. I'm from Haigazian University with some of my good friends. I specifically want to give this to Professor Geukjian to follow up with something you said in the beginning of your segment. You said that it's very important to remember U.S. and Russia relations in any equation, in any conflict, whether it's through peace or in a conflict. What, in your opinion, what balance can be found in regards to U.S.-Russia relations, added with the fact that now, because of the war in Ukraine, and with emerging neo-Cold War power equations, leading Russia to double down in its relations with Eastern partners like Iran, North Korea, how do you see things going forward with the necessity of U.S.-Russia relations, but now with this new reality? And something to add really quickly, something that I noticed that wasn't really tackled that much was the U.S. and Turkey equation in the Middle East, which is, there's the theory that Turkey is a guarantor of Middle Eastern stability in the Middle East for the United States. But now with the equation changing because of multipolarity and Turkey moving to normalize with Syria, what do you make out of all of this? Thank you.
Last question, please, quickly.
I have also a question for Dr. Geukjian. You mentioned that Assad is manipulating Russia and Iran in a way to their needs and his interests. My question is, why is this kind of manipulation has not been very visible in southern Syria. I mean, Russia has participated in kind of negotiating with leaders in Sweden, lessened tensions, and also conducted had some role in some reconciliation agreements in Iraq. But nevertheless, the outcome of these micro interventions has been not very successful. Security instability is still very high, and the Arab neighbors are still very angry at the cross-border illicit narcotics smuggling and weapons smuggling. So can we say that Russia has abandoned southern Syria to the Iranians? And if not, then what exactly is the Syrian government's or the Syrian regime's stance on how to improve its relationship with its Arab neighbors on one hand, and how to curb the Iranian influence in South Syria?
Okay, I suggest, because we still have 10 minutes, that we take all these questions. We'll start with Yeghia, Hilal, and then you close, you take your time. You take whatever question you want, and you say whatever you want in order to conclude. Yeghia,
Well, the questions were not direct to me, but maybe a few comments on Turkey-U.S. relations. Despite the fact that Turkey is a NATO member, traditional, but Turkey is playing very autonomous actor. It's a middle power, rising middle power in the region. It has a say, sometimes also it pressures the U.S., sometimes vice versa. Turkey's interests to some extent are independent and in clash with the Americans in the region, but also Turkish objectives are defined to some extent from the domestic dynamics in Turkey, which is now changing. So we have to find how this evolution in domestic politics in Turkey is moving forward to also identify Turkish potential foreign policy making.
whatever.
No, I need to address an older question about objectivity and subjectivity and how researchers coin and frame their research questions. Now, different authors have different frames of mind, and they have different perspectives on regarding how they see the world, their world view. Now, when we deal with research, we present assumptions, we present hypotheses in case we are doing empirical work. And now our assumptions, our starting point depends on how we perceive reality. And research is about shedding light on an issue. In the social sciences, we do not prove anything. So the fact that we use different approaches reflect our state of affairs and how we see the environment around us. So it's not a question of subjectivity or objectivity, it's how we understand the situation around us.
Thank you, very useful. Please, Dr.
Ohannes. Concerning democratization, after the collapse, when Yeltsin was elected president, there was democratization. But Russia at that time needed the West, needed money from IMF, World Bank, and Russia was expecting to get. And actually, initially, they helped Russia. But back to the same point that we emphasized, Yeltsin expected that the West would respect Russia. Bill Clinton didn't, then Bush didn't, then Obama didn't, and now what will happen, I don't know. So it's very difficult to make a prediction here, and let's not make it, okay? You have an authoritarian ruler in Russia now, completely far away from the democratization process that Yeltsin started in 1991. I don't want to make a prediction because predictions are wrong. The other issue with U.S.-Russian relations, very shortly, if Russia and the United States are in good terms, I think many issues at the global level would be good, and conflict could be avoided. I would say if former President Trump will be elected president in the United States, of the United States in November, be sure that the conflict in Ukraine will end. Yes, I can make this assertion. And the conflict in Syria could end. Go back to the statements that Trump made when he was president. When Trump criticized domestic American politicians and praised Putin and Assad at that time. So things will change, and if a new approach is adopted by the newly elected president of the United States, certainly there will be, that will have an impact on conflict resolution and peacemaking in Ukraine and Syria.
Okay, Dr. Ohannes, I'm taking this bet, and this will be in 1 year, the next discussion here on that table with you and the rest. Hilal wanted to add a two fingers note.
Yeah, speaking of democracy in Russia, there was a question, had Russia been democratic, would it have attacked the Ukraine? Now, Russia does not have democratic roots. Until the third quarter of the 19th century, Russia was characterized by serfdom, and serfdom gave rise to what became known as a subservient population. Democracy does not spread among people who are subservient. You need to have individuals. So, I mean, I understand that Gorbachev introduced new thinking about democracy and open-mindedness and solidarity and openness to the West, but there's a gap between expectations, between what one's wants and reality. So the reality is that Russia was still and will continue to be undemocratic.
Yeah, this also leads us to, or takes us to a very theoretical question in political science. Do democracies go to war or not? I mean, this is a very cliche question also. Now, what remains for me is to, first of all, thank you very much, really. I think it was a very, very vivid debate. We opened a lot of things. We didn't close them, luckily, and this means that things will go on. This is a place where we debate, we, as Dr. Hilal said, we put on the table hypotheses and assumptions. We don't close the debate, so you are always welcome to come here and debate. Dr. Ohannes, we owe you a big thanks, first of all, for the book, because I think it has added a very important piece of literature on a conflict that is still to be understood and analyzed. Also, thank you for your generosity here and for accepting our invitation, and consider IFI also as a house for the department and for yourselves. Thank you very much.
The same from my side.
Thank you.
You're part of
Thank you for
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our speakers.